007's hunt for a weapon of mass destruction and the Russian agents who stole it comes to a close, but he gets caught in an explosion that's too big to outrun. Does he escape it? And if so, how? We're going to talk about it right here in our review of James Bond 007 number 6 from Dynamite Comics. See you in 3. Welcome back to Comical Opinions. This is our review of James Bond 007 number 6. Before we dig in, let's recap briefly what happened in issue number 5. James Bond tracked the Russian camp responsible for field testing the Stalvoda weapon to a location in the Syrian desert. He was double-crossed by his guide, left to die in the desert, but eventually he made it to the camp, snuck in with lots of stealth, spycraft, and a whole lot of luck. But unfortunately, when he radioed in for airstrike support, he gets caught by a very large Russian. That brings us to James Bond 007 number 6. We pick up with the cliffhanger, where Bond now finds himself mano a mano against a large Russian soldier who isn't too keen on people snooping around. Bond is no match for the Russian's superior size and strength, but he stabs the Russian up through his chin and into his upper palate, which effectively binds the Russian's mouth shut to keep him quiet, but it is not nearly enough to put the Russian down for good. Despite Bond's efforts to keep the fight quiet, it eventually starts attracting the attention of Russian soldiers that are nearby. He's soon surrounded, but his imminent capture is interrupted when air support arrives and begins strafing the facility with automatic weapons fire, cutting soldiers down left and right, but somehow easily missing James Bond in the melee. Even with all that chaos going on, the large Russian with a knife through his mouth still manages to relentlessly pursue 007. Bond communicates with the fighter pilots to tell them where to strike, which tents to hit, where to find the targets that they're looking for. And he says, I've got a new plan. So he lures the big Russian up on the top of a supply truck, jumps off, and then tells the fighters to strafe the big Russian, effectively cutting him in half. Now free to duck and cover, 007 gives the fighters the exact tent location of the Stalvoda weapon. The fighters bomb the tent and immediately shoot up into the air to avoid any of the backlash. The explosion sets off the device, which creates a tidal wave of instant freeze ice spewing out in all the directions. Just as the wave is about to reach Bond, who's running for his life, he turns around and activates a small electrical device that he got from Vickers that disrupts the molecular structure of the Stalvoda wave and converts it to harmless water. Well, that's the end of the fight, but it's not the end of the mission, because we still have a loose thread, which is who was it that tipped the Russians off and stole the device in the first place. And for that, we're going to move over to a quick epilogue where we're not going to spoil who it was, but it's somebody you've already met in the series, and James Bond does what James Bond best to make sure that that loose end is tied up for good. And that's the end of the issue and also the end of the miniseries. So let's start over talking about the technical aspects, beginning with the character work. Garth Ennis, who is the writer on this series, gives James Bond all the super spy, superhuman capabilities to wiggle out of sticky situations that you could possibly imagine. They don't call him a super spy for no reason. And if there was any doubt after the end of this finale, there won't be, there's just nowhere to go, because Garth Ennis creates and constructs scenarios that just you can't swallow almost, and that'll come into play later in the review. But 007 manages to get out of it, and it elevates his character to super spy status, as it should be. Let's move over to the artwork with Rafa Labosco, who is the main artist on this book. Generally speaking, very good all the way around. The action, and there's a lot of it, there's a very action-packed finale, is energetic, fast-paced. You get a few nail-biting moments and a little bit of gore as well. This is one of those unusual James Bond miniseries where you have some bloody violence, gory, organs spilling out types of violence, and it's all handled pretty well. That said, the big fight between James and this large Russian with a knife through his mouth is a fight that you would expect. It's very sort of Indiana Jones-ish, very James Bond-ish. But the choreography gets lost about halfway through the fight. There was a whole entire sequence of panels. We could not figure out what was going on and which way characters were moving or how those movements were supposed to take place. So it, generally speaking, looks good, but there's a point mid-fight where you just get lost, and that's a shame. Let's move over to talk about pacing and structure. Consistent with Rafa Lobosco's energetic art, Garth Ennis's script starts with a sprint and doesn't let go to the very end. It's a very rapid fire issue. Lots of things are happening, boom, 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 and you get a commendable example of stacking conflicts to keep the reader's attention. So you have at the one layer of the fight between James and the Big Russian, and then another layer of the fighter jets strafing the field. So you have all these things stacking on top of each other, and that really keeps the tension high and the pace up, which is good. However, the structure is where the story starts to fall apart a bit. First, the Big Russian's antics, after he gets stabbed through the mouth, which effectively keeps his mouth closed, become almost silly, comedic. I don't think it was intentionally comedic, because when the Russian soldiers come over to find out what's going on, the Big Russian is just sort of waving his hands around and trying to do some pantomime or charade-like hand movements, and it comes off as funny, which is not what you want in this big tension-filled finale. Second, there's a scenario where for example, James Bond leads the Big Russian on top of a supply truck, and he just orders the fighter jets to cut him in half. Fighter jets moving at very high speeds do not have that level of accuracy. They just do not. And then so they're strafing through the encampment, cutting down Russian soldiers, but always seeming to miss James. And I mean, pinpoint accuracy that is at unbelievable levels. So it just doesn't work that way, and it just really takes you out of that moment. Third, when the Stalvoda wave executes because the bombs hit and destroys the weapon, James is somehow able to outrun the wave temporarily, turn around, and then activate the electronic buzzer that turns the wave off and converts everything back to water. There is no way that an explosive wave that is essentially blossoming out in less than a second or so, that James would have enough time to execute all that running, stopping, turning, activating device, and surviving all that. There's just no way. I mean, on the page, it looks like a small nuclear device going off. There is no way James would have time to outrun it, let alone execute that series of movements to get himself out of it. It just doesn't make any sense. And then lastly, when the fighter jets come in, James hears on his earpiece that one of the fighters is a woman who he's had, how should we say, relations with. And so now when this fight is going on and James is fighting this Russian, and he's trying to direct the fighters to which tents to target, and all these high impact, high energy, very edge of your seat, nail biting moments are happening, she's basically criticizing him and taunting him a little bit, sort of in a playful way, but still it's like, this is a serious moment. This is a life or death moment. Why are you bickering with each other over a past date or how well he's doing his job? Well, nobody wants to be nagged when they're fighting for their life. I don't know, for the life of me, I don't know what Ennis was thinking in this finale, but he made some critical creative mistakes that just don't sit well, and it's a shame. Let's switch over to talk about themes a little bit. Is there a theme in this issue? Well, not really. I mean, if you want to peel back the layers, it's pretty superficial. There's not much to it. It's basically a standard hero quest. The hero has to overcome what appears to be overwhelming odds to stop the bad guys from doing bad things. There's not much more depth to it than that. Let's take a step back and look at the big picture. And out of curiosity, we wanted to know, is there a real life Stalvoda project? Is there some sort of military weapon or research or historical record indicating a device where, when set off, creates this sort of flash freeze effect that kills human targets, but keeps all the buildings and the materials and any research or machinery and resources intact? And the answer is, so far, publicly, there is nothing. Couldn't find any. However, there are theorists that have presented ideas about how such a device could work, and pretty much it's been described as it appears here in this story. So final thoughts. What do we think about James Bond 007 number 6 from Dynamite Comics? You get a climactic battle, some cool visuals, and all the loose ends, for the most part, get tied up in a neat little bow. That said, Ennis incorporates more than a few plot developments that are really hard to swallow, that are unintentionally funny, or just take you out of the moment completely because it just doesn't make any sense, or it's just too unbelievable to swallow. And then the big fight between James and the Big Russian, drawn by Lebowski, just gets confusing and lost in spots. It just looks like a sequence of random panels, which is a shame. Therefore, we're going to give James Bond 007 number 6 from Dynamite Comics a 6 out of 10. Leave us your thoughts down below. Are you a James Bond fan in general? If you are, give us a thumbs up and let us know what you think about this miniseries. Or if you prefer a different writer from a different miniseries that you've read before that you like better, leave that recommendation down below and we want to hear all about it. And maybe we'll cover it on the channel. So thank you very much for joining, and please stay tuned through the outro for the next review.